Hi, thanks so much for having me today. My name's Adam Martin, and today I'm going to talk about how GIS mapping is used in the modern newsroom to visualize data and tell stories. I'm going to share lots of examples of journalistic work that utilizes mapping technology to help visualize news stories for audiences. I'm also going to talk about the process of creating and designing graphics on deadline. So let's go ahead and get started. So like I said, my name's Adam Martin. I am a teacher at the Merrill College of Journalism at the University of Maryland. I teach classes about coding and design and data visualization. And previously, I worked at the Baltimore Sun for about 15 years, where I led the graphics and data desk in the newsroom. So, as I recently said on Twitter, while I've created hundreds of maps in the newsroom, I really have no formal GIS training whatsoever. Everything I know is hard-won through research and through trial and error. I'm in no way a GIS expert, so please be nice to me. And I think a lot of the maps I'm going to show you guys today are really, especially the ones I've made, are really not super sophisticated from a GIS perspective. They're simple, and that's really on purpose, right? The reason for this is that my goal is always to communicate data in a really simple, clear, and straightforward manner. I want people to understand my maps really quickly and easily. Often I'm trying to make a point or to push a story forward in a specific way, right? To communicate some sort of message or some sort of data point through my maps that I want readers to be able to understand immediately. And I think that the simplest or the best way to do that is often through really straightforward, clear, and simple graphics and maps. So how are maps used in journalism? Well, really they're used in much the same way that maps are used everywhere, right? They're used to analyze and to visualize geographic data, to help readers put news events into a geographical context, to show where something happened, right? To compare and visualize trends, to communicate patterns, to tell stories visually. We use maps a lot, as we'll see later, for election results. We use maps to communicate scale, to simplify complex data, and as you all know, just for much, much more. So here's a great quote that I found from Robbie Deming at Esri in a blog post that he wrote. By mapping stories about people and places, journalists connect the where and the why. And I love that quote. And of course, mapping is a pretty broad term, right? We use all kinds of maps in the news. We use simple locator maps, and we use choropleth maps a lot. We use interactive maps, dot maps, animated maps, and really everything in between to tell different types of stories. Oftentimes the first step in the job is trying to decide what kind of graphic is appropriate for the data that you have and for the story that you're trying to tell, right? So that's really where we start. We say, okay, well, this is a map. This data deserves to be shown in a geographic context, and I'm going to use a map. And then we start thinking about what maps are appropriate for that data and for that story we're trying to show. So I'm going to show you guys a lot of maps today, and most of the maps we'll look at pretty quickly, but I'll do a deep dive into a few, really talking about the process of how we created the maps, the data that's behind it, the design, and also the thinking that went on behind those maps. So when I think about using maps as storytelling, I think about a few things. First of all, how can I push the story forward with my graphics? And this really comes from the world of photojournalism. First thing a photojournalist, a photo editor will tell you is that photos are not just pretty pictures included in a news story, right? A photojournalist's goal is to help push a story forward with their photos, right? How can I help tell the story and also propel the story forward for the reader? When I make maps, I'm trying to think about how I can help people understand the data that's underlying the map, right? How can I help them understand what this data is saying? And a lot of times I'm trying to think about the absolute simplest possible way to present that data. We do a lot of iteration in the newsroom, right? Here's 5, here's 10 different ways that I could visualize this data. And it often, 9 times out of 10, comes down to what's the simplest way to present the data so that people can understand what it says very quickly and then move on with their life, right? Oftentimes we don't have a lot of time. to tell people our stories, right? People are scrolling down a page. A lot of times they're online, they're reading a story. They didn't necessarily come to look at your map. So I want to present that data, get that data in front of them, communicate my message to them in the quickest and simplest way, so that they can go on with the story. At the same time, I'm trying to come up with really visually interesting ways to present the data. I want people to find my maps interesting, right? I want the graphics on a page to be a visual hook that help draw people into the story and keep them interested, perhaps as they're going through big blocks of text. The Baltimore riots were a real turning point for me in terms of visualization and especially mapping. After the Baltimore riots, Baltimore was being talked about in a lot of national media. And I saw a lot of national media outlets, including the New York Times and Vox and 538 and lots of others, publishing and visualizing data about Baltimore with really virtually no context. I just didn't think that national news outlets were doing a very good job talking about Baltimore and talking about Baltimore data. And ultimately, I thought I could do it a lot better. And luckily, I had a platform at the Sun to do just that. Let's face it, Baltimore is a city of inequality. What neighborhood you live in has a tremendous effect on what opportunities are available to you. And this extends from everything from income to education to health to climate, as we'll see, to life expectancy, and just so many more factors. I started creating maps that tried to visualize data that says just that and put it into perspective for people. So one of the first maps that I did that looked at this was this map that I worked on at the Sun with my colleague Greg Cohn that we called Mapping Inequality in Baltimore Neighborhoods. We made this in 2015, and this works with the Baltimore neighborhood data, which I love and I'll talk about more here in a couple minutes. But what this does is it maps out 4 different factors over Baltimore neighborhoods: unemployment, income, life expectancy, and homicide rate. And it maps it over Baltimore communities, right? The community statistical areas, the CSAs, as opposed to the neighborhood statistical areas, which are much smaller. I think I like to use the community areas. I think they're more meaningful. Certainly they I think better represent the communities that people consider themselves living in. I think the neighborhoods are a bit too small. So here we see unemployment in Baltimore. We can see unemployment is high in downtown, right, in the sort of inner city areas, and stays pretty high in the areas directly east and west of that area. We see unemployment is lower up in North Baltimore and down around the water, and as we start to get out toward the suburbs. And we see that these factors, are very similar in these areas as we look at other data points. If we look at income, right, we see some correlation here, right? Same with life expectancy and with homicide rate, right? Those neighborhoods downtown that tend to have high unemployment also have low income, also have lower life expectancy, and also have a higher homicide rate. And if we look at, let's say, these sort of leafy green, as we'll see in a minute, suburban areas in North Baltimore, like Roland Park or Guilford, we see that they have low unemployment, high income, high life expectancy, and low homicide rate. Right, so this map lets people look at, as good data visualizations do, it tells a story about the data as a whole, but then lets you sort of drill down by neighborhood to find your own stories. So, one of the points I like to point out in this map is life expectancy is just particularly tragic in Baltimore. If we look at Upton, Druid Heights, or Sandtown, Winchester, where Freddie Gray, where the riots happened and where Freddie Gray was picked up, we see the life expectancy is 65 years. Right next to it in Upton, it's 62 years. But if we go up to Roland Park, we see it's 83 years. Right, so we have a 20-year life expectancy difference in neighborhoods that are literally just a couple miles apart. It's really, really a tragic situation. So this is one of the first maps that I did that I was really proud of using this data. Sort of similarly, I like to show this map that looks what we call legacy of segregation in Baltimore. And I like to show this when it was picked up by Alberto Cairo, who published it in his book, The Truthful Art, something we're very proud of. Alberto Cairo is certainly a big influence of mine. And I highly recommend any of his books if you're interested in data visualization and journalism. But what this map shows is different racial populations living in Baltimore City and in surrounding suburbs. So white dots equal white population, yellow dots equal black population, and red dots equal Asian population. And this really, clearly illustrates what is often called Baltimore's white L, right, that runs from North Baltimore down through the center of the city, then around South Baltimore in the water. Baltimore's black butterfly, which goes out into East and West Baltimore and sort of spans into the suburbs. And then we can also identify little pockets of Asian communities throughout Baltimore. Right, so by itself tells a really interesting story, sort of on a meta level, but then also allows you to dive in a little bit deeper to find stories of your own. So more recently, I've used the Baltimore neighborhood data for a project that we called Code Red with the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at University of Maryland. So what we looked at here was how climate change is actually already affecting the most vulnerable populations, especially poor people in the inner city. So we're going to scroll down a little bit and look at a few maps that I made here. So we used data from that was collected by some researchers from the Virginia Science Museum and the University of Portland. They used sensors and went around Baltimore on a hot summer afternoon and collected temperature data from all over the city, just thousands and thousands of data points. And we were able to do a little bit of data work and come up with average temperatures per neighborhood, which is what you see here, right? So we see really hot areas downtown, right, where there is very little tree cover, where there's lots of concrete and lots of buildings. We see things are a lot cooler in what we will call the leafy suburban areas of North Baltimore. Things are a lot cooler out here where we have like Leakin Park, which is the largest urban forest east of the Mississippi, and just generally cooler in the sort of outer sections of Baltimore where we tend to see more trees. As you can see here, Madison, East End, it's the hottest area at 98.3 degrees. And across town in Dickeyville, Franklin Town, which is, again is right next to Leakin Park, it's 90.5 degrees, right? So that's like an 8-degree difference. This is, on the exact same day, just a couple miles away. So that's pretty shocking. So again, I went ahead and mapped some of the Baltimore neighborhood information, quality of life, and health information, right? And we can see some correlations between poverty, lifespan, crime, and unemployment. So poverty tends to be higher where it's hotter, lifespan tends to be shorter, rates of violent crime tend to be higher, and unemployment tends to be higher in the hotter areas of the city, which is pretty shocking. I wanted to show a few other maps from this project, especially one where we looked at the role of trees. And so what we did here is we used a storytelling device called Scrollytelling, where we changed the map as the user scrolls down the page, right? So here we're using a satellite map where we're showing tree cover across Baltimore City, and you can pick up, it's easy to pick out from the satellite photo where there's lots of trees. Leakin Park, Druid Hill Park, Lake Montebello and Herring Run Park, Patterson Park, etc. So we see, again, we're going to look at Roland Park, which is washed over in deep green, has tree canopy covered streets and houses with an almost suburban feel in Roland Park. So we also saw high life expectancy, high income. So 2/3 of the neighborhood is covered with tree canopy in the summer. It has more tree canopy than all but a few Baltimore neighborhoods. On the other side of this, Broadway East is, we see light concrete, black roofs, gray streets, and there are many fewer splashes of green. Broadway East has about a 10% canopy cover, 6 times less than Roland Park. Across Baltimore, neighborhoods have vastly different levels of canopy cover. So we see that neighborhoods in the north and west have a lot, and neighborhoods in the east have little. And trees have a big impact on temperature. And this is where that scroll is really highly effective, right? We see tree cover here, and when we scroll down, we can see temperature, right? And it's like a complete inverse, right? Trees have a huge impact on temperature. So that's one reason why Baltimore's tree canopy map looks like the inverse of the heat map. And so we took this a little bit further and actually looked at redlining and tree cover as well, where we can see neighborhoods that were classified as high risk or desirable or declining by redlining in the 30s. So Roland Park in the 30s was marked as still desirable, and Broadway East as definitely declining and hazardous. And so we had one researcher tell us that the areas with the least amount of tree cover today are in those red line neighborhoods. And we were able to bear that out with this map, right? That the neighborhoods once labeled the best have the most with 45% tree cover on average. And so we sort of call this the legacy of redlining on tree cover. So again, I just wanted to give a big shout out to BNIA that I heavily rely on the vital signs by community data that Baltimore Neighborhoods has put together. I love this data. I've used it for years. I will continue using it. I just wanted to thank them for putting that out there and for the research and the work that goes into it. I also use data from Open Baltimore a lot. I use Maryland's IMAP. I use data from Maryland Department of Planning and lots of other places. I generally don't have to do FOIAs for geographic information. Maryland puts a lot out there, and Maryland state government is usually pretty responsive to requests, which I really appreciate. So, this is my tech stack. I tend to use QGIS to do GIS work. I use Adobe Illustrator to do design work. I use JavaScript to make my interactive maps. I like Leaflet and D3 and a few other libraries to make maps. In general, I prefer using vanilla JavaScript for everything, but for mapping, certainly Leaflet and D3 are fantastic. I use R to do data analysis, and I use, I like the off-the-shelf technology from Data Wrapper, Flourish, and Carto to do sort of quick and dirty mapping. I use those a lot. I really like them. And I think this is pretty typical of how maps are made by journalists. Certainly at the Sun, I used Esri products, but I switched to open source once those resources weren't available to me anymore. I'm sure there's lots of other ways that journalists make maps that I'm unaware of. We do a lot of 3D mapping these days, and that happens with Three.js and Blender. Lots of data journalists use Python instead of R. That's a conversation that happens across lots of fields. I think the most important thing when we're talking about technology is just to stay agile, right? To be willing to learn new things, to really stick it out through the frustration. I've never taken a GIS class. I find QGIS to be really arduous program to work in sometimes. You have to be willing to fail and fail and fail again, right? And just sort of stick it out through that frustration. I just do a lot of research and a lot of trial and error in QGIS. But I think it's important in this field to just be passionate about learning. For instance, these days I'm really diving a lot deeper into D3, which is a pretty complex JavaScript library, and I plan to do a lot more mapping with D3. I really got started in GIS just by using something really simple like Google Fusion tables and making static locator maps in Illustrator, and then just sort of slowly expanding my skill set based on needs and on ideas. The only technology that's really important to me, I would say, in my stack is Illustrator. I can't output the kind of maps that I want with QGIS or with Arc. So from a design perspective, I need to be able to export things as vectors and bring them into Illustrator and unpack them and change everything and sort of make it look the way that I want it to, so I have a lot more control over the final look of a project. You can't really practice journalism in Baltimore without covering crime. I spent a lot of time at the Sun creating graphics and maps to help visualize crime data. I wanted to look at couple quick maps here. The first one is this homicide map, which is one of the most popular features on the Sun. This is a map we made it a long time ago. It's gone through lots of iterations, but it has data going back from to 2007, which is when we first made this map. And we've redesigned it a few times, but it's really a really valuable resource. And the reason I wanted to talk about it is I think there are two notable things about this map. The first one is that it serves one of the really essential functions of journalism, and that's to watchdog the police. We don't get this data from, Open Baltimore or from the police department. This data is collected by the Sun and is used as a watchdog with the government. And that's the other thing I want to talk about was the reporter who collects this data is Justin Fenton, who's a really dedicated and dogged crime reporter for the Sun. And he maintains this database. This is his data. He collects it, he maintains it, he keeps it current, and he uses it to double check and keep the Baltimore Police Department honest, which is really important. At the end of the year, we make sure that our numbers, or the Sun's numbers rather, are the same as the police numbers for homicides. And if anything's different, right, we talk that over with the police and try to square everything up. So this is a really long-running and popular feature on the Sun that's a source of just really, really valuable information. Okay, so the other map I wanted to show having to do with crime is this robberies project that I worked on. So this is one of my first attempts at sort of analyzing data and using it to tell a visual story. Kevin Rector wrote a story about that robberies were going up in 2016. I heard about it in a budget meeting, and I decided that I could dive into that data and help tell just sort of a more nuanced story about how robberies were going up and in what way that year. So I just grabbed all the robbery data from Open Baltimore and sort of mapped it here in Carto, which is really simple to do. You can just sort of allow people to sort of go through that a little bit and click on specific dots and get more information, etc. But I analyzed the data and I tried to tell a story with it, right? So looking at robberies, we see that street robberies were by far the most common type of robbery, and they had gone up that year. And carjackings had gone up that year, which I believe they've continued to go up. So we see carjackings by month. We see them having gone up in the fall, which is something we saw across this data, which again is kind of unusual. Generally, crime is worse in the summer. We'll look at carjacking by neighborhood. And then I went through and started identifying specific corridors where a lot of carjackings had happened, right? The places where you were sort of most likely to get carjacked in the city. So here's a corridor along North Avenue, West North Avenue near McCullough Street, not far from Sandtown, where a bunch of carjackings had happened. Similarly, around Holland's Market, there had been just a lot of carjackings, and I made these maps in Carto, then brought them into Illustrator, sort of put these flags on them. Looked at street robberies, found out that a lot of street robberies were happening downtown. So made this map just sort of looking at all the robberies downtown and where they had happened. And we see a lot of robberies happening like in the same place over and over again. A lot of robberies happening right around the Baltimore Arena. A lot of robberies happening in the proximity of Baltimore Street. And actually the corner where the most robberies were happening was just a block away from Lexington Market at the corner of Saratoga and Utah. So anyway, just sort of diving into the data and then using mapping to help tell that story a little bit. So my process when I'm making maps, right, is I try to talk to reporters and editors really early in the process, try to participate in the reporting, brainstorm with the reporters and the editors about how we can tell that story from a visual manner. Do we use maps? If we're going to use maps, what data do we need? And then obtain that data, generally through open data portals or through FOIA, PIA requests, whatever we need to do to get our hands on the data that we need to tell the story. Then once I have it, I clean the data using R, using OpenRefine, then analyze the data, what we call interviewing the data, right, which is where we come up with a list of questions and then we do data analysis to try to answer those questions. Then I'll do a lot of visualization prototyping, just with pencil and paper, drawing, or with Adobe XD. and just sort of looking at different ways that I can tell that story, just to sort of give myself an idea of the options. And then once I've zeroed in on how I want to create a visualization, I'll do more of a high fidelity mock-up in Adobe XD. I used to use Photoshop, but I think XD is a little better for that these days. Then I'll come up with a tech plan, which if I'm using QGIS is generally going to involve me doing some research and learning some new tech. Then I'll build my maps using JavaScript or QGIS. I'll style my maps using CSS or Illustrator. And then if it's an interactive map, do lots and lots of testing, browser testing, mobile testing, and generally have to do some refinement based on that. So for me, these are some really important elements whenever I make a map. I always want there to be descriptive headline and chatter, or what we just call, the sort of, the couple line description that goes between the headline and the map is what we call chatter in the newsroom. And to me, it's really important to let people know exactly what they're looking at, right? I don't want there to be any question about what data it is that I am displaying, or what it is that I'm visualizing in a graphic. I want that headline and that chatter to be incredibly descriptive and very clear about what it is people will be viewing. And I also try to use the chatter to help tell the story a little bit, right? Like, what does this data say? Just to do a slight little bit of data analysis for people that are looking at it, so they sort of know what the data is saying before they even have to look at it. I also try to have really clear sourcing on every map that I make. I'll never put out a graphic or a map without a source ever. And I also try to use graphic design fundamentals: contrast, repetition, alignment, unity, gestalt, really contextual and conceptual use of design and color and typography. And that's where that's where graphic design really comes into it for me. Trying to have sort of concept-driven, idea-driven design elements that help push a story forward, push a graphic forward, and also using color and design to sort of contextually place a graphic within the story and also within the other design elements in a story. So election maps are a really big deal for news orgs. The news organizations generally spend a lot of time with creating voting rigs. But what's more interesting to me is how we use maps to sort of look at elections afterwards. Here's a voting map from the Post. And these are some folks that are really good at mapping: Tim Menko, Dan Keating, great data journalist. I don't know Joe, I'm sure he's great too. These are some heavy hitters, right? And they call this the political winds in the U.S. are swirling. This is just a beautiful map, right, that shows how different areas have gone from red to blue or blue to red between the 2016 and 2020 elections. And this is just really conceptually driven, right? We see the wind being used as a concept. We've seen the color blue, and even the position, right? Things are either going left, right? So they're going towards the left political spectrum, or they're headed right towards the right of the political spectrum. And just really beautifully done mapping work and design work here. And if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see some of this animation being used to show changes between the 2012 and 2016 election, where a lot of areas sort of moved to the right. And here we see change from 2016 to 2020. We see some areas going more to the left. I think just really, really beautifully done maps here. Here's a map that I did that shows voting by precinct in Maryland at the 2020 election. And I got this data from the Maryland Department of Elections, and I just cleaned it up, mapped it. Only took about 30 hours to map it to all these small precincts in Maryland. And I worked with a grad student here at Maryland, Sean McGoey, he actually wrote the story. I did the data work and the graphics. But we were able to pull out some interesting stories out of this data. For instance, if we look at Baltimore City, which is one of the most democratic cities in the country, usually entirely blue, we saw a couple interesting places that were red, right? Some working class areas in East Baltimore, some areas that have a lot of Orthodox Jewish population in Northwest Baltimore that went red. And actually, if you zoomed out a little bit, you would see areas right on the outskirts of the city that went red. If we looked at, where I live up here in Northeast Baltimore, if you go up Harford Road, you see things turning red as soon as you go over the city line, which is kind of interesting. Here we have Frederick County, which you can interestingly see this sort of hard line where Frederick County goes from blue to red right above the city of Frederick. Here we see Allegheny County, which is all red except for the population center of Cumberland and Frostburg, where Frostburg State University was. And in fact, we saw that all over the state where areas that were college towns were like a tiny little blue dot inside of a big sea of red. So one of the things we have to consider when we're making maps for the news is working on deadline, right? Breaking news doesn't wait for your map to render, and I think that oftentimes, right, we make sacrifices for deadline. I would love to have had more time to work on some of my maps, but unfortunately, that isn't always an opportunity that's afforded to us. We also have to think about journalistic ethics. We have to be fully transparent about how data is collected, by whom. One of the major points from the SPJ Code of Ethics that all journalists follow is do no harm, right? And this includes, ethics for maps include things like changing scales, using inappropriate colors, using data from partisan organizations, and thinking about how revealing data location could harm people or put them in danger. So there's lots of awesome maps made by other news organizations that I'm not going to have time to go over today, but here are some publications who do this really well. Certainly the New York Times and the Washington Post, ProPublica, The Pudding, Vox, 538, Axios, and lots of others that I'm not thinking of. When I think about how I use GIS as a consumer, I very rarely go out looking for any sort of GIS information, right? Everything that I do is really story driven. So when I have a story and I go out looking for GIS data to help me tell that story, what I'm looking for is clean, well-sourced, unbiased to the degree that data can be unbiased, data that's relevant to some news story that I'm working on. So for GIS, I like maps to be available in both shapefiles and as GeoJSON, though of course you can do some conversions yourself if necessary. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed putting this presentation together. I was really excited to talk to you guys. I'd love to know you. Perhaps you can help me understand how to appropriately set CRS and QGIS, which is something I've never really understood, or help me answer any of the other million questions that I come across on a weekly basis about GIS. Please reach out anytime. Here's my information. I really enjoyed speaking today, and I look forward to answering your questions.